Okay, so since 1968, Jersey Overseas Aid has been working around the world responding to humanitarian crises, supporting international organisations, Jersey charities, and running community work projects with Jersey volunteers. They currently support international development projects in 6 target countries. Anybody know who they are? It's a matter of interest. Any guesses? Rwanda, well done. Rwanda, Malawi, Ethiopia, Sierra Leone, Zambia, and Nepal. So Simon is an excellent person to tap up if you're needing some really good coffee in terms of some of those countries. Whilst their support for humanitarian crises and Jersey charities is actually worldwide. So our guest speaker today, Simon Boas, joined Jersey Overseas Aid in October 2016. Prior to that, he spent most of his career designing, implementing, and evaluating aid projects in developing countries. He's managed UN and NGO offices and programs in the Middle East and South Asia, and has worked for the Palestinian and British governments. His experience runs from long-term development policy making to immediate post-disaster relief. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Simon Boas.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you all very much for coming here today. So what am I going to talk about? Let me first see if I can work the slides. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview about Jersey's Overseas Aid Programme, which, as Jennifer says, has been running for more than 50 years. But mainly I want to talk about philanthropy and donorship, and specifically what makes a good donor. Why don't we just write a check to the Red Cross every year and be done with it? Why should you, as individuals and as representatives of the private and public sectors, do a bit of homework before funding a charity? The answer, of course, is that not all charities are the same. And even not all projects run by the same charity are the same. The Red Cross can be great in Kenya, okay in Sierra Leone, and this is true, shut down for corruption in Liberia. And the same, to some extent, is true in Jersey. And the point is that we, as funders, have a responsibility only to fund the best projects run by the most effective and accountable organisations. And every time we fund something a bit rubbish, we let down the people we could have helped. And also we, as Jersey Overseas Aid, we are guardians of your hard-earned taxes. So we let you down when we don't spend your money wisely. And we also contribute to mediocrity in the third sector if we don't demand and reward best practice. Because at the end of the day, only funders can drive up standards. And that's true whether it's a multi-million-pound grant or your £3 a month to help feed a goat in Ethiopia. It's true if it's a one-off donation to a medical charity. And it's true about the partners you choose to help through your corporate social responsibility programs. So there are several things that we do at Jersey Overseas Aid to ensure that our funding has the biggest possible impact, and also that it supports and nurtures the best organisations. And I want to share 4 or 5 of these with you in the hope that it will help Jersey become even better at helping those less fortunate than ourselves. And at the end, if there's a bit of time, knowing that you had a bit of information about Ukraine recently, I'd like to tell you a little bit more in more detail about what we're doing there. Now, if it's all right with you, I'm going to wander around, partly because I feel I'm in danger of falling off that podium, which would be a pretty embarrassing start. So firstly, just to introduce myself a bit more, I've chosen the most embarrassing photo I could find from my aid career. That's after 3 years of eating nothing but chicken shawarma in Gaza and only moving around in an armoured car. So I'm 10 kilos heavier, but even more embarrassing, I've got not just one, but both of my armoured cars stuck in the sand in the buffer zone, having committed the very schoolboy error of sending the second one in to try and get the first one out. But yes, as Jennifer said, I spent my career working in lots of different countries in aid and development. I sort of worked my way up through small charities to bigger ones. I worked for a developing country government, and then I sold my soul to the UN. And came to Jersey in 2016 to try to help Jersey meet its own objectives in overseas aid. So, yeah, Jersey's been giving aid since 1968. And the two key things, of course, that we try to do are international development to help people help themselves out of poverty through longer-term development projects. And we also respond to disasters and emergencies. And there's two other objectives that we have that I'd like to highlight. We want to do that by helping Jersey, individuals and organizations like yourselves, to get involved. So, of course, we fund Jersey charities, we send volunteers abroad, we have internship programs, placements with the UN, and we try and build the capacity of not just charities, but other organizations in Jersey to be as good as they can be. And that all contributes to the fourth objective. You know, we're spending your money, and there is some quo with this quid. We want to help change the narrative about Jersey. Lots of friends tell me that when they first went off to university and told people they're from Jersey, the first thing people said was, oh, tax haven, and oh, you must be a millionaire. I want people to say, Jersey, brilliant. You've lifted hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty with your cows in Africa. And I think that's really possible. So one of the things we're trying to do is fly a flag for the island. And we do that in four ways. We have four types of projects that we fund. We send volunteers abroad. This year is actually the 50th anniversary of our first community work project. We've sent something like 1,000 islanders abroad for 2 or 3 weeks at a time to build clinics and schools, to provide emergency care for people with disabilities. And as I said, we've got lots of bursaries, placement opportunities, and internships, which I'm really happy to talk to anyone who's interested more about. We fund Jersey charities. These can range in size from little kitchen table organizations set up by a couple who wanted to help a village that they spent some time in Gambia or Uganda, all the way up to the Royal Jersey Agricultural and Horticultural Society, and Durrell, of course. We fund emergencies and disasters. We've been doing a lot in Ukraine. I hope to have a few minutes at the end to tell you a bit more about that. But pretty much everywhere where there's a conflict or a disaster, a famine, a pandemic, Jersey money has been there to support it. And then lastly, we have these longer-term international development grants. And I'll go into some more detail about those. But I'll just point out that we seem to be known in inverse proportion for actually how much we allocate to those things. We spend more than half of our budget on these longer-term development projects, about a quarter on emergencies, about 10% on Jersey charities, and only a little bit, in fact, far too little in the COVID years, on deploying Jersey expertise and volunteers abroad. So how much do we have each year? I'll spoil the surprise immediately. In this year, our budget's nearly £13.5 million. I don't know if that surprises people. It's a lot of money, of course, and it's a lot of money for a small island. It's £130 per person, and we really remember that in JOA. We have a responsibility to islanders whose money it is. Equally, it's just a bit less than Jersey spends on its pets. It represents about 15p for every £10 you spend in tax. So I always like to think that for the £9.85 that stays in Jersey and the 15p we spend in Africa, we can almost have a similar impact. In terms of global aid flows, it's not very much. It's about an hour of what the world spends on aid and development every year. It's about 8 hours of what the UK spends. But the great thing is we've now benchmarked it to the size of the economy. And it comes in this year at 0.27% of GVA. And we hope it's going to go up each year to get a little bit closer to that black line, which is the OECD average. Because, of course, there's a UN target of spending 0.7% of GDP on aid, which very few countries meet. But we're slowly getting there. We're slowly climbing the table, which is great. And, of course, the other great thing about this benchmarking, it means that if the economy contracts, so does the amount we spend on aid. I was going to point out, perhaps I still will, having been told we have guests from Guernsey here, that they're not on the table, but we spend twice as much as our cousins in Guernsey. and 4 times as much as the Isle of Man. But I would humbly suggest we should be comparing ourselves upwards and not at those jurisdictions. So how do we do it? How do we ensure that every penny is well spent, that we meet this dual obligation to the world's poor and to you whose money it is? Well, there's 5 things I want to pick out today, using what we do as examples, but I think they apply in almost every circumstance. They even apply if you're public sector commissioning charities to provide services for people. First of all, it's about playing to our strengths, and it's about really knowing about what we care about. So our international development grants, we have narrowed down thematically in the last few years, just to 3 priority areas. And anyone who knows Jersey will understand immediately why we've chosen those areas. We fund dairy, we fund financial inclusion, which is a way of basically saying financial services for the poor, and we fund conservation. Now, some of you will have heard of our dairy work. In Rwanda alone, a female Jersey cross is born every hour. So that would be nearly 14 today. And it's extraordinary the difference it makes. The average African cow produces 1.5 litres of milk a day. The first generation crossed with a Jersey is producing 6 or 7. And with the training we also give in husbandry and nutrition and animal health, it can get up to even higher. The first thing you notice in a village is that the children in a family are much better nourished. You can measure that really easily with a tape measure around the upper arm. And then you notice that there's a bit of extra money because there's some more milk to sell, and then the girls are going to school as well as the boys. And it has a kind of ripple effect out through the community. We're working in Rwanda, we're also working in Malawi and in Ethiopia, and we're about to start these projects in Zambia. And in Rwanda alone, for example, we've targeted 24,000 smallholder farmers in the last 5 years, each of whom has an average of 5 relatives. So just in Rwanda, we've reached more than the population of Jersey. Our second theme is financial inclusion. Jersey is obviously a world-leading financial services centre, but I think it's fair to say that mostly we provide financial services for the wealthy. But that expertise and that capital can also be deployed for the benefit of the poor. A lot of you will have heard of microcredit, so giving people small loans so that they can start a business, often to women, and that works really, really well. But micro savings in some ways can be even more important. We're quite good at getting people out of poverty now, but what tends to happen is people's incomes rise and rise and rise, and then there's a shock, and they plummet to nothing again. The roof blows off their house, or there's an unexpected death or medical bill, and people go back to nothing. Whereas if you've got somewhere safe to save your money, you're resilient to those shocks, and you can weather them and continue to get a bit better off. We're not just doing kind of last mile services, we're also working with regulators and central banks in our target countries on things like risk-based supervision. Again, as a relatively small donor in the great scheme of things, we're always trying to find ways to maximize the effect of our giving and trying to do things upstream with regulators, for example. Trying to do things with research. In the dairy field, we're doing 2 bits of research on the economics of crossbred dairy cows in Africa. These are things that can potentially reach tens or hundreds of millions of people. And the third theme, we call it conservation livelihoods. Now, obviously, we're very lucky to share our island with Durrell. And you probably know just what a good organisation Durrell is internationally. Last year, 1/4 of all the species that came off the IUCN Endangered Red List were because of Durrell. And what we do there, obviously our interest is in the people, not the animals and the ecosystems. But there's an increasing realisation that those 2 things have to go together. It used to be that conservation organisations, and still to some extent, are a bit distrustful of human development, because after all, it is the poor that chop down the forests or dynamite the reefs. And there was a long feeling of kind of fortress conservation, keep people out at gunpoint. But not only is that not ethical, it's not sustainable. the real way to save threatened ecosystems is to give the poor people who live in or near them a stake in their preservation. So we work alongside Durrell and several other conservation organisations, ensuring that poor people who live in threatened areas have ways of making a living, not only which don't harm the forest or the area they live, but actually gives them a reason to preserve it. Like this chap in Ethiopia with his forest beekeeping. In Ethiopia, one project alone is helping to protect an area 43 times the size of Jersey. We're having a huge impact. So playing to your strengths applies, I think, much more widely. You know, all of us, in our own personal giving, in our corporate giving, getting to know the things you care about, whether it's a medical thing, a community thing, an environmental thing, makes you a much better and more discerning consumer of charity projects. And a kind of related thing is to try and focus. Jennifer already mentioned, we've narrowed down our target countries to 6. 5 years ago, we were working in 45, and we spread ourselves really, really thinly. But the point is, if you focus what you do to 2 or 3 issues, you can not only get to know them better, but the money you spend there can have a kind of cumulative effect. Your projects can turn into programs. And so we've narrowed them down to these countries, and I'll explain why we chose these in a minute. But what it means is, and also thanks to the fact that we have a Minister for International Development and the fact that there is a great deal of buy-in at political level, means that we know the new Zambian Minister of Fisheries and Livestock. We have a relationship with the Dairy Development Board in Rwanda. We know Nepal's 5-year dairy strategy, and that makes us a much better donor. How did we choose these countries? In a sense, choosing any is better than doing too many, almost randomly, but we didn't. We're the only country in the world to take corruption into account when choosing its target countries. CPI is Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, and every country in the world is ranked based on lots and lots of data. HDI is the Human Development Index, which is a measure of poverty and is a kind of proxy of education, health, and longevity. And what we try and do is work in countries that are really needy, but not very corrupt. That's hard to find in some ways, because of course the two are correlated. But that number on the left, the HDI rank, is how poor they are, the higher number being the poorer. And the number on the right is how corrupt they are, again, the higher number being how corrupt. And you'll notice that all of those countries are significantly poorer than they are corrupt. And somewhere like Rwanda is less corrupt than Italy or North Korea, although it has been pointed out to me that I might not be saying a huge amount. So we've focused on our countries and we've focused on our themes. And the same is true of most good donors. And we're getting a reputation as well in these countries and themes, and that, of course, helps us fly a flag for the island. The third thing, I call it tough love. You don't have to read all of these things, but we have introduced a huge range of forms and processes that help us work out whether a charity is any good or not. Charities are strange things in a way, because unlike the private sector, where your funding is pretty directly related to the quality of the goods and services you provide, charities can be really, really good and not very good at raising money, or they can be not very good and really good at raising money. And the two are often really quite disconnected. So the challenge for a donor is working out whether a charity is effective and good value for money and is doing things properly. And we've introduced a whole range of ways of doing that. When I took up this post nearly 6 years ago, I got lots of invitations to go and visit projects in different countries. And they were planning to do to me what I, when I worked for the UN, used to do with other donors, which is take them to the best functioning women's group and then maybe to the village for the cow dance and a feast in the evening. And then you as a donor actually leave knowing less about the project than you did to start with, because you think everything's brilliant. And I told them that if they see me, I'm going to look at the minutes of their procurement committee and follow a receipt from payment request to execution to recording. And suddenly all of the invitations dried up. But we do it nonetheless. We do it before we start every project. We do a field visit. We do it in the middle of every project. And they're like mini audits. And we do it at the end of every project. And we also pay independent evaluators to look at the efficacy of the project, but also the finances of the project. We know before we fund anything, not only what their accounts have been like for the last few years and whether any expenditure was disallowed by a donor, but we know about their safeguarding policy and their terrorist financing policy and their money laundering policy. And that sounds like they must hate us for this, but actually good charities really want to show you that they're doing this well. And especially if you're doing it in the spirit of not, are you passing or failing, but, can we help you? We try to show charities, we understand that all charities can get better, and we want to support the good ones to do things better. Obviously, if you're giving personally much smaller sums, you're not expected to do this, but you can still look through annual reports. Or you can still look at the Charity Commission in Jersey or England and Wales and Scotland. You can get a lot of information about what charities spend their money on, what their staffing is like, looking at their accounts. And it's really worth it, as I say, because if we don't insist on high standards, they simply won't be followed. And then the best charities won't be able to compete with the ones who are just better at raising money. So the fourth thing, and the bit I'd probably get quite boring about, so do sort of go like this, is we call it logic. And it's basically the idea that every project, first of all, you should think of what the needs are. Secondly, every project is a hypothesis. And thirdly, everything can be measured. And those three things go together, and we call them logic. Now, here, we've got some people building a bridge from one side to another. You think, what needs, what's the problem that they're solving? Everything should start with thinking, what is the problem that is being solved? So potentially here, we've got a group of people, one side without access to employment or health, and the problem is they're poor and in poor health. And so we think, how can we solve this? And the hypothesis here, obviously, is we build them a bridge to the other side where there's hospitals and a labour market, say. And what you can do is you can tabulate every hypothesis in every project, saying, basically, if we do X and Y, then these things will happen. So if we put in these inputs and build a bridge, we'll allow people to go from A to B, and then they'll be able to access markets and hospitals, and that will improve their health and incomes and well-being. And at each stage of that table, you're asking how questions, starting at that needs statement, at that objective. How do we improve their access to healthcare? How do we improve their incomes? The hypothesis is, well, we enable them to travel from A to B. At each stage, you can question that. Actually, would it be better to build a hospital on this side? No, we perhaps find the evidence that it's better to connect them to the other side. And our hypothesis is that it's better to build a bridge. But again, we should be questioning at each stage, would it have been better to build a boat? And before we fund any project, even before the first foundation stone is laid, we're looking at this theory of change behind every project. Likewise, going upwards, you'll notice it's why. Why are you building a bridge? So people can get to the other side. Why do you want them to get to the other side? So they can access labour markets and hospitals. You might even ask why again. Ask why like a toddler. I find myself doing that all the time to get to the nub of any project. And then the great thing is, at every stage of that, you can measure it. You can measure, of course, whether the bridge was built, and you can find lots of ways of verifying that. But the problem is, and this really, really applies, it's the single thing you should take away, I think. So many charities stop their reporting at their activities. They say, yes, we built the bridge. Yes, we ran the training course. But they need to go further than that and tell you what the impact was. And good charities can show you that. They want to show you that. And there's lots of ways of doing it. There are two kind of related problems that you often come up with here. I call them the hammer problem and the magic bullet problem. The hammer problem is that, as you've probably heard, to the man with a hammer, every problem is a nail. And so there's lots of charities that specialize in doing one or two things, and some of them do them really well. But then they want to apply that specialization to pretty much every situation. And in some it will work, and in some it definitely won't. The related problem, the magic bullet problem, is that, especially in international development, everyone's looking for the one solution that's just going to end poverty. And people often think they found it. There's a famous example called play pumps. I don't know if anyone's heard of that. About 20 years ago, an organization noticed that in African villages, women spend a lot of time cranking a single hand pump to get water up from the well, and they've got to take turns, and it takes a lot of energy, and it's a pain. And they also noticed that children didn't have much to do. So they introduced, what do you call them, roundabouts, the things that kids sit on and spin round on, connected to the water well, which sounds genius. The roundabout does the work, and it pulls the water up, and it sits in a tank, and then people can just go and access the water by turning on the taps. And it looked like it worked really well. And loads of donors poured in thinking, that's the solution to so many questions. The Clinton Foundation and the Bush Foundation both put 8-figure sums into it. But there were some big problems that really only emerged a few weeks after they were installed. First of all, the kids didn't really like them because, the fun of the roundabout is that it's pretty frictionless, not that you have to sort of push it round. So the kids stopped using them. And then if you go back and see them now, if they're still working, and there's plenty of African villages with rusting roundabouts in, you see old women basically harnessed to the thing, drawing up water in a way that was much, much more difficult than when they had their old hand pumps and they wanted them back. So always think, is this the right solution for the problem? And what might be the unintended consequences? So I'll give you a last example before moving on. Digging a well. People think, there's no well in this village, the village needs a well. Well, first of all, things don't have needs. It's really important. I'll say again, things don't have needs, people have needs. Villages don't need wells, schools don't need libraries. People need access to uncontaminated water and good health. Children need a good education. Hospitals don't need scanners. People need to be diagnosed earlier so that their diseases can be treated better. And if you think along those lines, then you realize that it's much, much easier to think, what is that ultimate goal? What is the hypothesis, and how can we measure it? So if you're building a well in a village and asking those why questions like a toddler, why? So people can have access to clean water. Why do they need access to clean water? Well, two big reasons in Africa. One is that women who have to walk miles to get water otherwise are often assaulted when they do so. And another one is that kids in Africa miss an average of 25 days schooling a year because of waterborne diseases. So if you dig a well in the village, the women don't have to endanger themselves spending hours walking in the night to get water in the morning. And the kids are going to miss less school. And you can measure all of those things. And you can even go one level up and say, well, if the kids are missing less school, are their exam results better? And that kind of thing. And good organizations measure things. And whatever anyone tells you, it's not that difficult. And then finally, I was saying do no harm. We obviously tried to make our volunteering trips slightly less perilous without taking the fun out of them, although that is actually quite a recent photo from Nepal. I don't know if that attracts you to them or not. But the main point to remember is that not every donation is necessarily just going to do good. There's lots of ways you can actually do harm with a donation. Some really big examples, and I'll focus on the emergency side for a bit, were, after the tsunami, hundreds and hundreds of organizations all rocked up in the affected countries, doing relatively small projects that weren't very well coordinated with each other. The same happened after the Haiti earthquake. And that, of course, is wasteful. When there's plenty of money sloshing around, it fuels corruption. But also, you can create a kind of brain drain. All these organizations come and hire the best possible people who could actually have been better off working for local government or for their communities. I think the biggest thing, the most important thing, is sending money, not stuff. Now, Jersey's just done a brilliant thing with Ukraine, and it worked, partly because the Polish consul did it so well with help from other Jersey organizations and us a bit. We sent 14 lorry loads of things to eastern Poland, and 70% of those actually, I was there the other day, have gone into Kiev, which is great. But the problem with collecting things in an emergency, well, there's lots of problems. First of all, the quality varies widely. Some of you may have gone and bought brand new sleeping bags, and some people were basically using the ones that had survived 3 Glastonburys. And all of this stuff has got to be catalogued, bagged up, transported, catalogued the other end, quality controlled, warehoused and distributed. And that's really expensive. And also, even if everything was a brand new sleeping bag, just the fact that you've bought one kind and you've bought another kind, when you're actually distributing them to people, who decides who gets the slightly better model or the slightly warmer one? You're much better off letting aid agencies use their own supply chains, which tend to be much cheaper, buying quality assured things of the same standard and delivering them. And the same goes actually in emergencies. Increasingly, we don't send cooking oil and food, even in famines, as long as markets are working. Because what you do then is you undercut local suppliers. You put them out of business, the local cooking oil and flour producer. And you've, at great expense, shipped truckloads of things somewhere. And you think, well, at least they're not going to spend that money on booze and fags. But what happens is a market immediately springs up and people sell the cooking oil and flour. And if they want, do spend it on booze and fags. But of course, every family is different and every family has different requirements. So increasingly, aid agencies give people in need cash as well. And we should certainly be giving aid agencies cash using the controls and the checks that I've been talking about. I've seen, so I was in Sierra Leone last year and I went to the one pediatric hospital in Freetown. There is a ward, I kid you not, a whole ward of brand new medical equipment donated by well-meaning hospitals and doctors around the world. None of it is being used because no one had really thought about, does this plumb in with the rest of the system and processes? Who's going to repair it when it breaks? Where do we get the spare parts? That kind of thing. So even high-value stuff usually isn't worth sending. So just think when you're funding charities, what could the unintended consequences be? So those were 5 quick things. I will quickly sing our own praises, but that's all I'll do before moving on to Ukraine. By focusing, by getting to really know what we're spending our money on, by doing proper due diligence, and specifically and particularly, and if you remember nothing else, by measuring impact, we are now, amazingly, not just in internal audits good books. I think we're the only state-funded body which gets a perfect score at internal audit, but even the Taxpayers Alliance, which is not always known in different countries for liking aid organizations, says nice things about us on their website. So as I said, I've just had a 4-minute gong from Murray, which is perfect. I will give you just a very quick info about what we're doing in Ukraine, because I know it's really interesting, and I want to, although we're not fundraisers, I want to finish this with a kind of call to action, if I may. You will all have been horrified about what's going on in Ukraine, the number of people who've been displaced, both internally and externally. And of course, it's actually getting worse at the minute. More Ukrainians are dying at the minute than they were at the beginning of the war. It's very difficult to see a good conclusion, but the needs are huge and they're increasing. Jersey has been really and typically generous. I should mention, actually, did you know that Jersey, the average person in Jersey gives twice as much to charity than in the UK? We're a really generous island, and that's why it's so important we make doubly sure that that money goes to the right place. For Ukraine, Jersey Overseas Aid has put in $500,000 of its budget so far. We have to shepherd it a little bit because, of course, there's lots of other crises in the world, not least those caused by the huge spike in food prices caused by the Ukraine crisis. The government gave us an extra $1 million, and Jersey Side by Side the charity set up in the tsunami, has been raising money from the public, and you can still donate to it. And it's raised nearly £800,000. And we promised that we would spend that money immediately. Another huge problem in emergencies is that big organizations develop huge war chests. I'm sorry to say to anyone who has generously given to the DEC, the Disasters Emergency Committee in the UK, that many of their recipient charities are sitting on huge sums of money and can't spend it. We know that for two reasons. One is that all the charities we are funding, we have put a clause in saying they need to spend it within 3 months. And some of the big ones, the DEC-funded ones, said, no, we can't do that. We've got too much money. And some of them are now subcontracting some of our charities to deliver aid into Ukraine. And on our website, you can see what we've been doing. We've been funding things inside Ukraine, outside Ukraine, refugee reception centres, and we have been providing but not sending stuff. The one bit of stuff we sent, which actually was great, were 200 oxygen concentrators that weren't needed, were purchased for COVID and weren't needed from the hospital. But we could make sure they were needed because we've got partners in Ukraine who have worked with the Ministry of Health for more than 20 years. When I received a list from the hospital, I sent it to them and it went to the Ministry of Health. And they said, no, we don't need that, but we really do need those. And we can repair them and we can operate them. And thanks to Jersey Post, in fact, these made their way to eastern Poland and are already being used in medical centres throughout Ukraine, which is fantastic. But we've also supplied medical kits for doctors. We've supplied ballistic vests for medics. Recently, 52 incubators for premature babies, maternity bags, and contributed we're also funding Ukrainian women to be trained in mine disposal. So Jersey's response has been fantastic. But my final thing is just to flag this to you. So Jersey Overseas Aid is not a fundraising organisation. We don't want your money. We have occasionally, when organisations have had a big sum that they want to donate to one of our key causes, we've been able to help them do that at low cost. But we are entirely government funded, and I think that's the way it should stay. But we're helping side by side, and the bailiff, who has brilliantly set up this appeal since the Ukraine war started, to raise money, and we are spending it according to those standards that I've been telling you about. The money started drying up, and we need more of it, I think. August the 24th is Ukraine's Independence Day. It marks 31 years of independence from Russia. We think that's quite a good hook to hang things on. The JEP's on board, lots of others are on board. It's really a watch this space. But what we hope to do is some big events in Jersey to raise some more money for the Ukraine crisis towards the end of August. So I'll finish there, Maury. Jennifer, thank you very much for having me, and open it up to any questions. Thank you.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. Chamber's also on board with that, by the way, on the Independence Day. So count on us to get it out to our members as well. In terms of questions, if we've got questions in the room, very happily take them. Raise your arm and we'll get a microphone over to you as quickly as possible. And whilst you're thinking of one, controversial one, Simon, I saw Nepal and I saw Malawi among countries there, and I know you referenced their issues as well as their poverty. How do you balance countries that have really poor human rights issues? I think of Nepal and I think of Malawi straight away. And I was reading, before today that one of the problems in giving money sometimes is that you're giving money to countries that could help themselves because they've got money, but they don't because they're getting money from somewhere else, making it too easy for them. You get the principle.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question, and it's what a lot of people think of when it comes to overseas aid. You think, why are we sending money to this country with relatively corrupt leadership, and actually they're spending quite a lot on MIGs or sponsorship of a football club? Why are we sending our hard-earned money there? I mean, the truth is, where there is need, there is also, I think, an imperative to respond. But what we try to do is respond in such a way that not only doesn't strengthen a regime, but can empower its people. So we never give money to, we're unusual among country donors in that we never give bilateral aid. In fact, the only, as I said to the Women's Institute in St. Martin, the only thing we ever give any other country government is finest quality Jersey bull semen. And there's a limit to how much that can be misused. But we make sure that money doesn't go to governments, and it can't obviously be spent on weapons or on oppressing its own people. We do our best to ensure that the people we support, and especially women, have a better understanding of their rights.
Questions in the room? You've got a silent audience. I'm not even going to be drawn into the St. Martin's Women's Institute, and no, because that would be going too far. If there are businesses, and there will be, and there are corporate businesses, and there will be meetings that will be had by some of those that are in this room and others, saying, right, we're raising some money, where's it going to go? And then there'll be a round table, and there'll be an argument and some good proposals put forward. Are you and your office and Jersey Overseas Aid, you said you're not a fundraising organisation, but you can help. Are you available to give guidance? Is there guidance available?
Definitely. Really want to be able to do that, and we have been doing it. In fact, not just to businesses, but sometimes to branches of the public sector too. We understand that it has to be proportional. It's not that every donation you need to go through these reams of paperwork and due diligence and oversight. But it is possible to do it proportionately. And we're really happy to help because, as I said, one of our missions is to help Jersey become a more effective centre of philanthropy. And that goes through for the private sector too. And it is possible for businesses and for individuals to look at different projects and different charities and really draw distinctions between them at how good specifically they are at accounting for what they do and measuring their impact. And those are the absolute top two things.
Question at the back.
Simon, can you persuade this audience to read Factfulness, which is such an excellent exposition of the relativity of poverty and how much small increases make an enormous difference?
I will try.
This many times.
Thank you, Jeanette. Factfulness was done by a brilliant, now recently died public health official called Hans Rosling, who more than anything else could just present data brilliantly. But what he points out, and what actually few people in my sector point out, but it's true, is that the world is becoming a better place. Too many people in international development will stand up and say, everything's getting worse, we just need your X pounds to try and make it a little bit better. But the world is genuinely becoming better. More children reach their 5th birthday, more women are educated, more people have more money to spend, more people have goods, have shoes, have refrigerators. And that's really good. And Hans Rosling shows that. And very specifically, one thing I'll dwell on that he shows, I mentioned earlier about how sometimes there's a conflict between conservation and development. And some conservation actors still think, well, actually, if you give poor people livelihoods, they just breed more, and then there are more of them, and there's more of a problem for the planet. But that's not true. What Rosling shows brilliantly is that there are 2 things that will reduce birth rates, and they've done it in every single country in the world. You educate women so they have families later, and you make sure that children don't die before their 5th birthdays, and people have fewer children, and that's happened in every single country, and there are very few left over where birth rates are 8 or 9. So I highly recommend Factfulness.
Okay, one final question from Kevin.
Simon, I think we're in Volunteers Week this week. So you haven't said much about the importance of volunteering. We know how important it is in Jersey. How important is it to Overseas Aid?
Oh, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I think it's hugely important for lots of reasons. First of all, it is not just the importance of a project done in a country or a community to that community. That's almost taken as read, but it is. Our volunteers have done some amazing things in different countries. But it also does 2 things for us, I think. It creates a link between individuals and communities here in Jersey and ones in Uganda or Nepal. And that's brilliant. And so many of those Jersey charities that we support started off from volunteering trips. Secondly, I think it has a huge impact on the volunteers themselves. They come back with new skills, new networks, and more than anything else, a new outlook on life, a new frame of reference. Employers tell us that it's brilliant for HR development and even staff retention. And a lot of employers now give people leave to come on our trips, including, brilliantly, the government now, which does 5 days of volunteering leave. And I think also the fact that we've sent 1,000 volunteers abroad in the last 50 years helps us, gives us a great deal of support, a grassroots support in Jersey. As I said, Jersey is this incredibly generous place. And Jersey, unique in the Anglosphere almost, received overseas aid within living memory. People here today might not have survived the war without 5 trips of the Vega bringing Red Cross parcels. And if the people of New Zealand and Canada had said, why are we bothering with that? A lot of people wouldn't be here today. So there's this great foundation of support for overseas aid in Jersey. And my mission might be unattainable, I don't know, is eventually if we can make the people of Jersey as proud of its aid program as we are of our cows.
You'll have won. Ladies and gentlemen, Simon Boas.